Jonathan, it's wonderful to hear good news about cancer centers now in March 2025. So you've got good news.
Outstanding news. We learned just earlier in the week that we're the 73rd NCI designated cancer center.
This has been in the works for quite a few years. How many
Yeah,
years?
we had a long haul. I think that's pretty typical.
Yes.
I started as director about 10 years ago. This was clearly in mind, but we really were working in earnest since 2016 when we had a retreat that resulted in the plan to get NCI designation. We applied in 2021 and received an excellent score at that time. But the NCI made a decision that we should come back in with an A1 application. So in 2024, we put in the A1 application and we learned that we were funded.
Fantastic. But uh, just to be sure I understand this, this begins with you or does it begin with Dr. Fisher? The
Well,
quest.
I think Dr. Fisher, when he was hired in 2001, had spoken about getting NCI designation. He spent much of his initial efforts here raising funds for a new building that I'm sitting in right now. That was clearly an impactful part of this. Uh, I will say, though, that it was really in 2016 that we had some of the magic around alignment of leadership both at my level as well as the senior leadership of the institution that led to the necessary investments to make this happen.
What did it take?
So, we're a matrix cancer center, and it's always a little bit challenging to come up with a final number. But if you look at capital investments as well as personnel investments, easily more than 100 million was invested in this project.
That's actually kind of modest.
And I think, Paul, part of that is because we were a little bit different from many of the other new cancer centers that have come online in that we had a lot of strength in basic science. We had, funding that was at a reasonable level for a long time. What was missing for us was a lot of the organization and a culture around a CCSG. And honestly, I spent more time probably building culture than anything else, obviously very important in this entity. And then as we matured, we started investing in community outreach and engagement and some of those other pieces. But in the end, we ended up recruiting about 30 funded investigators. So that was still a significant endeavor, but it's not as if we had to buy entire research programs like some of the other new cancer centers had to do.
Oh, fantastic. So what finally got this to really happen? What got you over the threshold?
So I would say there were a few critical pieces, and as you say, when you see one cancer center, you see one cancer center. So I don't know if these are really lessons for others, but the first 2 years of my tenure as cancer center director, we built a regional network. We moved from 2 locations to 13 locations involving linear accelerators and um, chemotherapy infusion throughout our broad region, which is a very large rural region. And that was important because part of that generated the patients that we needed to defend clinical trials in rare and complex cancers. That was also important because it helped us raise resources that the institution could invest specifically in cancer. And I think that got the attention of senior leadership that led to, really, I think, much more openness around the necessary investment to get to the CCSG. The other pivotal part was the first meeting of our external advisory board, which was in 2018. Mark Evers chairs that group. And we have several cancer center directors on that group, including Candace Johnson, who's, down the road 70 miles in Buffalo, who is very much in support of this.
Interesting. So you had a next closest competitor
Right. And I
on
think,
your EAV. Wow.
yeah, we'll come to that in a minute because I think it's clear that we're not really competitors.
Right.
But that board meeting was essential in multiple ways. First, it humbled me as a leader and our team because they pointed out that we still had a lot of work to do. But importantly, they also said with clarity that they could see a path that, we really should do the work because we could get there. And our senior leadership, our CEO and dean at that time, heard that message. And that's when really we could do what we needed to do. And in fact, even through COVID with financial pressures, this investment didn't slow down at all the way through to us getting the grant just this week.
You mentioned that line where you've seen one cancer center, you've seen one cancer center. That's Joe Simone, or at
Yeah.
least it's attributed widely to Joe Simone, although there are versions of it, like you've seen one community health center, you've seen one community health center, you've seen one blah blah, you've seen one blah. So it's a but still it's pretty powerful line, which I love to quote. How is Rochester or Wilmot different from all the other cancer centers?
So we have to start by describing our catchment area, which is unique. Um, there are only 3 counties that overlap between our catchment area and Roswell Park. Our catchment area is 27 counties in central and western New York. All but 3 of them are not served by any existing cancer center. We're a white spot on that map. This catchment area has over 3 million people and is very rural. In fact, over a third of patients live in rural RUCA codes with a lot of access challenges. If that catchment area were a state, and it's certainly big enough geographically and population wise to be a state, it would have the second highest incidence of cancer in the country, behind only the state of Kentucky. A lot of it is that the demographics of our catchment area are much more aligned with Kentucky than they are with New York City. And in fact, 14 of the counties that are in our catchment area are officially part of Appalachia. And a lot of the rural poverty, sedentary lifestyle, high tobacco use, challenges with education and access to healthcare are drivers of cancer incidence in our catchment area as they are in other parts of Appalachia. So that's the beginning as to what we're about. We're the only academic cancer center that is capable of helping to bend that disparity. And I think that really resonated, despite the fact we're from a state that has a number of cancer centers. The majority of the state land area was not being served by any of those other cancer centers. Now, the other things that we bring that I think are somewhat unique, we have broad and well recognized expertise in cancer and aging. And this goes from fundamental biology of aging, looking at long lived rodents and mammals and understanding why they don't get cancer, all the way through to one of the largest geriatric oncology clinical programs in the country that has recognized for contributions around geriatric assessments and other features to predict outcome in older patients and to help decide treatment plans. A third unique part of Wilmot is that we're one of only 2 academic centers with an NCORE research base. The NCORE program does symptom management research funded by NCI in parallel with the cooperative groups. The other such cancer center is Wake Forest. And the University of Rochester has been long recognized as leaders in that symptom management field. And in fact, our cancer prevention and control program is our best funded program and scored very, very well in the review I think that's another area that I did not have to build as much as some of the other new cancer centers because we had that historical strength.
Plus, before that, you had a CCOP before any.
Yeah, exactly. This is the legacy of the CCOP. You're
Yeah.
exactly right. It's the Gary Morrow who ran the CCOP transitioned it to this NCORE research base, and he's still around as a senior advisor, but his legacy is really that NCORE research base.
Yeah, Gary is a giant in the
Yep,
field.
yep.
Yeah, absolutely. I used to talk to him all the time.
He's
Uh,
always a character to speak to Gary. He's he's quite entertaining and he says what's on his mind. So it's
Always
been
a
great having him
pleasure.
around.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about those 13 outposts, if that's the right word that you created. Did you buy practices or did you start your own? How did you do it?
It was a combination of a few different things. We leveraged the medical center, basically purchased a few hospitals in the region.
Mhm.
And in those hospitals, we created cancer programs. In two locations, we acquired practices that were there and took over those programs. And in others, we created new bona fide cancer programs from scratch essentially. So it was a combination of purchasing and opening facilities in strategic areas of strength where we had primary care base and where we recognized there was an unmet need for cancer services.
Mm, that must have been quite an undertaking. How long
It
did
was, I have to say, I didn't recognize it at the time. I wasn't even sure. I joined as director here. I was an interim director after Dr. Fisher left, and he left rather abruptly.
Mhm.
So it took a little bit of time for things to settle out. And then my first step, which was a bit of a comfort zone to me, was to kind of build this clinical program. And I have to say, it turned out to be incredibly informative as I was cancer center director because I really understood our region well because it took a lot of trips back and forth to all of these places. So I know the people there and we had to deal with their town boards and counties to sign off on this. New York State is a certificate of need state. So as we were building new infusion rooms, we had to deal with state officials as well. And that was a crash course in some of those features of being cancer center director. I now am privileged to have a medical director that helps oversee that component. But having built that, it really, I think, directly informed to me the need for us to have a CCSG. And it really created to some degree, as I said, the resources and the energy behind cancer. And I think when our CEO saw the success of those regional programs, he realized that this was the logical next step.
So it took several years, but didn't doesn't sound like it took forever.
When our EAB, as I said, when our first EAB met in 2018, I said that our plan was to submit in 2021, and they thought that was a very bold timeline. That said, I think that we had some pivotal recruitments that came through that really helped us. People like Paula Vertino, who was on Subcommittee A and came on as our associate director for basic research. David Linehan, who's our current CEO, but he came on as chair of surgery and our associate director for clinical research. And Ruth O'Regan, who's chair of medicine,
Mhm.
who oversees our CERTEC program. And, having that level of strength in our leadership group really helped, I think, to catapult us and move forward very quickly.
Yeah.
And the other thing I'll say, Paul, is that COVID, if anything, helped us a little bit because people weren't traveling and we were all in on this and we really didn't miss a beat. I think that having everybody around really helped us, writing things up and with Zoom and other technology, it instead of slowing us, it took away many of the distractions that otherwise could have been there.
Mm. I guess I'm sorry to be so non-linear I've been accused of that frequently. But how long have you been in Rochester, and what is your area of expertise, and what
Yeah,
brought
so
you to
so
Rochester?
I'm a lymphoma clinical investigator.
Mhm,
I trained at Dana-Farber, and then I worked at Dana-Farber as faculty for a couple of years before moving here to essentially join Richard Fisher. I moved here in 2002. And Richard was also a lymphoma investigator, so he was a mentor to me when I moved here. And I kind of rose through the ranks here. I became the chief of the hematology oncology division in 2009, and then the cancer center director in 2013.
mhm,
Academically, I'm still the chair of the SWOG Lymphoma Committee,
mhm,
and I sit on the Lymphoma Steering Committee. So I help run the National Clinical Trial Portfolio in lymphoma. And I'm also the editor in chief of the Journal of Clinical Oncology,
mhm.
which I've served in that role for about 3 years. And that's obviously an incredible privilege to kind of be in that seat.
You mentioned COE a couple of times, and maybe I'm just paranoid, but I'm worried about COE right now because it's a three-letter acronym, and some not particularly smart person might confuse it with DEI, which is also a three-letter acronym, which also is being somewhat misunderstood. Somewhat, I'm being kind here, as kind as I can be. Are you worried about losing COE and disparities research? How do you rely on COE?
Yeah, so COE has really been critical for us. As I said, the and to be honest, the CCSG really pushed us in this direction. 10 years ago, uh, we didn't even know what we didn't know about our catchment area. And it was really the CCSG that, pushed us to really invest in building the understanding as to what our catchment area needs are. Those statistics that I quoted to you earlier, I couldn't have told you 10 years ago because we didn't really know.
Mhm,
And that in and of itself has been incredibly motivating, interestingly, not only to the physicians here, but our scientists are so interested in what the burden is of cancer in our catchment area and how they may be able to contribute. And it's become routine now for our scientists to go to our COE office and get reports. And they even use that for their grants to speak to why this is an important place to study various cancers. So that part of COE is absolutely critical. And I think that, the whole CCSG enterprise and I guess it was Henry's vision to kind of see this, but to think that, we have these unique cancer needs in this catchment area that, even though we have amazing cancer centers in the state, like Memorial Sloan Kettering and NYU and all the rest, um, they're not going to pay attention to those needs. We need to do that. The second part of COE that took longer was the creation of the community advisory boards and trying to get bi-directional engagement over our research programs. And Erin Kobitz from Miami is a member of our external advisory board. And she really pushed us hard in this direction. And if you know Erin, that wouldn't surprise you. But the result was really some great examples as to how our research was improved through input by the community. And we now have a very vigorous community advisory board. We're making our public announcement tomorrow. They can't wait to be there. They've been part of this, for the last 5 or 6 years in earnest. And this community advisory board is an incredibly diverse group of people. Um, we have a lot of rural members. Rochester has the largest per capita deaf community in the country, based on schools for the deaf that are here and longstanding relationships. An example of how we've learned strategies to help engage that important patient population and understand what their needs are. So I remain optimistic about COE, whatever it's called. I think I would hope that all cancer centers directors recognize the importance of serving their community. That's why we're here. That's the mission of academic medical centers. And I'm, feel that, we didn't have a CCSG until earlier this week. And we made the decision to invest, and our budget for COE is over $1 million a year. We're investing in COE activities, including a large office with numerous people and including staff that sit in some of the rural counties to make sure that we're educating and engaging those individuals. I do not see that stopping. And I think that's investment has really only helped us.
Otis Brawley is always quoting that number uh, from one of his papers, one of the ACS papers, that the largest underserved population in the United States is white.
But numerically, right. And, I think we have clear challenges in our urban centers with, very diverse populations racially and ethnically, but clearly across our catchment area, poverty in all but one of those counties has disproportionate amounts of poverty. And a lot of that is rural poverty and an aging population in, you know, demographics, as I said, that are similar to Ohio and Kentucky.
So that would be largely white,
Yeah,
dominantly white.
right.
Interesting. Um, can you imagine if, can you even have disparities research if COE is not there? Would become kind of undoable.
I think COE has been helpful at helping us understand what disparities exist.
Hmm.
And at some level, that information base is critical to proposing any research. At least what I've been hearing is that disparities research as a scientific subject matter remains okay. Um, you're correct in saying that I think some individuals are challenged by differentiating that from the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. But we remain optimistic that disparities research is going to go on, and it's an important component of our cancer center.
What about Surtec? Is that?
Surtec is, we did very well on Surtec. I, don't like to talk about scores, but for a new cancer center, we got outstanding to exceptional on Surtec. I
Mhm.
think that we've been recognized nationally for a very long time around quality of education here. Many luminaries in cancer have come through the halls here, particularly in hematologic malignancies. And, I think we've leveraged that. One of Gary Morrow's contributions, we were talking about him earlier, is he has a T32 in cancer control research that really focuses on symptom management. And in their most recent renewal of that T32, he got a 10 and perfect score. And I think that, that speaks to some of the strengths we have in Surtec, that we have some of these very well recognized education programs.
Hmm. Hmm. What about uh, 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 indirect costs? I mean, that's like something that everybody is talking about. How is that affecting you?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, with the current pause, we haven't seen a change yet at our institution, but clearly, our institution is under threat. Our current indirect cost rate is 51%. It's lower than some of the highest institutions, but clearly substantially higher than 15%. And that delta would be, potentially paralyzing to broad research programs at our institution that even go beyond cancer. And I think it's, you know, been quite revealing how, we've stumbled into this indirect way of funding essential research elements, and being able to uh, basically translate that explanation to lay people who don't understand how this research is funded and what this is really paying for is challenging. Uh, and I've seen certain things written about it with some good analogies about how essential infrastructure is around research, and particularly research that requires high technology, shared resources, investments, and expensive laboratories, all of which are funded through the indirect cost mechanism.
What about data
So,
science? Can you do data science without indirect costs?
I mean, I think it's mandatory for all research, at least in the current funding model. And, if the vision is to move some of the indirect costs to direct costs, I mean, ultimately, that might be a reasonable goal. That can't be done in 12 hours or 12 days or 12 months. That's going to take time in order to understand how the budgeting is and what goes in and what goes out. And, I think that the abruptness of the decision making was potentially very challenging for medical centers. And it appears that we may have a reprieve for a few months, but I think in the big picture, all of us as cancer centers need to understand what the models are going to look like moving forward. And in parallel with always challenges to some of the other sources of revenue like 340B and site neutrality, I think it could be a perfect storm where research is really under threat. And, I have to say that the Cancer Centers group has been having meetings about this that I find very productive, because I think shared wisdom from all of the cancer center directors is going to be very, very helpful.
Yeah, maybe we should just go some more on the indirect. I have a question about CAR T cell therapy, for example. How much of your CAR T uh, is being done in through facilities that are funded through indirects?
Yeah, so we uh, m- most of the CAR T studies that we've done have been in collaboration with industry. We don't have a GMP facility making our own CAR Ts right now. So that's not as much under threat as some of the other clinical research that we're doing. And certainly, I think from a laboratory standpoint, that's an area that's only growing. We have somebody who's been very focused on some new solid tumor oriented CAR T cells and ways of directing CAR T cells using light and other ways to try to pull CAR T cells into cancers. And, all of that expensive work, including radiation, shared resources, and those sorts of things, would be very challenged without the indirect costs, without question.
Mhm. Well, I think that the 15 is not the number that's probably going to stick. What
Right.
I'm hearing in Washington, I don't know if you're hearing something else, is that it's more likely that there's time that to negotiate this thing. Time has been bought. So it's not going to be 15% or not 15%. So this litigation continues, that's fine. But some negotiating will have to be done. And
I've heard similar, rumors, I guess, that at least right now, the federal stance is that they're looking to have a fixed rate and not a variable rate based on institution. And that number is probably not going to be 15, but it's not going to be 50 either. And, it depends on where it lands. I mean, if it landed at 40 or 45, we could probably absorb that a lot easier than if it landed at 25.
those are the numbers I'm kind of hearing as a goal. But then
Right.
again, they can also put some things in direct costs that are
And
not
and I
indirect.
think that's the important detail that we have to understand. I mean, at some level, if um, if the budget for NIH stays fixed, and they're going to shift this into more research oriented investment and allow for some of the current indirects to be counted as directs, that may be in the long run more sustainable and better for certain investigators. It's just that seeing that path is not quite apparent yet, I think, to many of us.
This would be a very interesting set of negotiations, but I think it's also really to some extent reasonable to be expecting something more transparent than the current
I
system.
agree. I think that, the reason why we're in this situation now is that the current model of the direct costs are only partially funding research. And it's every institution, even with the indirect costs, is making an investment up to 50 cents on the dollar for research because, you know, it there's such limited budgets for NIH funded grants.
Mhm.
So if part of this fixes that piece, the modular grants haven't changed in like my whole career as far as how much they fund. And we know the level of inflation in science is higher than inflation nationally. If all of that can be fixed as part of that with greater transparency, I think that is better for the American public and for the scientists. But all of that has to be part of this decision. You can't just look at one line item and cut it and not fix those other pieces.
When this began, kind of in my spare time, I looked at the old stories we've done about indirect costs, and they go back to the 70s in the cancer letter. I have this one particularly fun story where Vince DeVita is raging that the NCI got certain thing, 11 million, some crazy number like that, and he has to waste all of this on SBIR and the indirects, which he doesn't want to pay, which
I
was,
mean,
yeah,
the other part that indirects really help pay for are the buildings where scientists are. And I mean, I think that's an important level of investment that goes beyond the scientists working in those buildings. I mean, that helps communities. There's construction and all of that is covered there. And there really isn't necessarily easy ways to put up those buildings without some investment by indirect costs. In the past, there was talk about having specific grants from the government for buildings like this. And instead, the indirect cost evolved as a partial mechanism to pay for some of this. So I think that's the other piece that would need to be part of any negotiation is to understand, um, you know, these buildings all need to house very high technology, fancy microscopes, radiation facilities, ventilation, all the like that needs to be in place for laboratories, and you need a way to pay for that.
yeah. Does your congressional delegation understand this? Have you explained it
We're
to?
fortunate. Our representative from Rochester is extremely supportive. He's been public about this, but he lost his daughter to cancer. She was cared for at our institution, and he's been a tireless advocate for cancer and NIH research. And obviously, our senators from New York have historically been very supportive.
Yeah. Who's your House member?
Joe Morelli.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. That would be very interesting to see what happens with this now. Um, I guess we've covered a lot of ground.
I
But I'm sure we
there's one.
missed something.
Yeah, let me add a comment about Roswell Park
Yeah.
because I briefly went through that and you mentioned the word competition. So Roswell Park is 70 miles west in Buffalo. They've been a longstanding NCI designated cancer center. And for many years, our scientists have often enjoyed collaborations with Roswell. It's drivable, particularly in the summer. In the winter, it's a snow belt, so depends on the day. But they have a lot of complementary strengths. There was a brief period of time where Dr. Fisher and Dr. Trump, at that time, who was leading Roswell, were speaking about a consortium cancer center between the two institutions. And as part of that effort, they actually even looked to ask the question, I mean, are they competing for patients? And it was very clear that patients in Rochester were not driving to Buffalo for care and vice versa, that they really were two very different areas. And the cities are somewhat different in historically as well. They're just because they're both in upstate New York, they have a very different feel to them. Buffalo is a more industrial city. Rochester's industries historically were Kodak, Bausch and Lomb, and Xerox. So, I would say that they were culturally somewhat different, and some of that has remained. So, um, the decision, it was clear that there wasn't competition for patients, but the decision was made at that time that it was going to be hard to build a consortium center. And candidly, we weren't ready for that. We weren't organized well enough. We decided we were going to go for the designation ourselves, but all along, Candace has been incredibly supportive. And I think she really sees the advantage of having two designated centers in this part of the country, that there's a lot of things like COE that we can collaborate on. And as I said, she was a member of our external advisory board. And I'll say that when we were practicing for our site visit, the most helpful practice that we had was a team from Roswell came and put us through our paces in a very friendly but supportive and rigorous way. And that was much better practice than even our external advisory board because they took a real fresh look for us. And I really thank them for that.
Mhm. When was your site visit?
About a year ago, it was in May of 2024.
And then you would have been approved in December,
Right.
maybe.
We heard initially in December that this was coming, and then um, the NIH was sort of in lockdown, as you're aware, since the inauguration. It took a long time for us to hear anything, and then it was only very recently that we had to make a couple of adjustments, and they funded us.
But the NCAB would have approved it in December.
That's correct.
Okay. Has the money come through, everything?
Yes, we got the NOA just last week.
Oh, fantastic. So it was just a little bit slower than you would have
Right.
expected. Not too bad. But it sounds, can you imagine the world without the NCI cancer centers or the world without NCI? I
I have to say, Paul, that um, you know, this CCSG process has made our cancer centers so much better. We're a real case study because 10 years ago, when I uh, was recruited for this position, I mean, I spoke to potentially doing this, but this was not necessarily a 100% expectation. It wasn't like, you don't get this, you're fired kind of thing. And what I can tell you is following the CCSG template, building the research programs, the infrastructure, the uh, CERTEC office, our COE office, all of those pieces in the way that the CCSG grant dictates has made us so much better. I mean, we doubled our clinical trial accrual. We understand our catchment area. We nearly doubled our NCI funding. We were able to recruit specialists, and we're just a much better place. So I have to say that although there are parts of this that can get a little crazy, and um, the site visits and the whole choreography and all of that, we've probably gone maybe a little too far. The process of pulling all of us together and making us all work on this over years has made us so much better. And I have to say that it would be such a shame for us to lose that. I think cancer is the envy of all parts of the medical centers because we have the CCSG. And, all medical centers are really forced to disproportionately invest in cancer because it's an expectation of the CCSG. And without having that infrastructure, I fear that, what the, the contributions that we've made in cancer and the leadership positions we have globally would disappear. So you're right. It's a hard day to picture.
Is there anything else we've missed? 'Cause there's a lot to cover.
No, I guess the one, final point I'd make is one of the happy surprises that I have is how supportive um, other cancer centers have been around this. You'd kind of think that at some level this is a competition, a grant, but it really feels like everybody is in it to help the patients. And we've had literally dozens of people from other cancer centers help us with various pieces of this, from informal consultations to, being members of our external advisory board to practice site visits and all of those pieces. And, I feel fortunate to be working in a field where people are so collaborative and collegial. It's really inspiring at some level. And I hope to be able to give that back now that we're officially part of the club.
Well, congratulations again. This is a happy day.
It is. We make the announcement tomorrow morning, and we got all kinds of signs. I even have here a cookie
Oh, a
with
cookie.
the NCI logo. We're going to pass these out to all of our faculty and all that stuff. So we're getting ready for tomorrow.
Oh, fantastic. I'm going to stop recording, but meanwhile, can we have a picture of the cookie?
Oh, sure.
I mean, like not right now, but maybe we
Oh,
could you could get somebody to do a good.
yeah, yeah. We'll send. I'll have Kelly take some pictures of the cookie and of some of the other parts of our day and send it to you.